My relatives didn't want my brother and me tearing each other apart over the family estate, so they basically sold me off. They pawned me, Morrison, to a billionaire family under the guise of a traditional good luck marriage. I got a front row seat to the family drama the very first day I moved into the mansion. The heiress, Sarah, was having a total meltdown, screaming at the top of her lungs while the maid's hand shook so hard she could barely hold the medicine bowl. I didn't even blink as I walked over to the chair. She just kicked across the room, set it upright, and took a seat. The butler, Mr. Wallace, stared at me in disbelief and asked if I was even a little bit afraid of her. I looked him in the eye and calmly told him she was my wife, so there was no reason for me to be scared. Wallace gave me a side eye that was dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt. He was clearly thinking that the new guy was trying too hard to play the part of the devoted husband. In his mind, being a bachelor for the rest of your life was better than being married to a woman like her. A fresh bowl of medicine arrived, but the new maid was too terrified to go anywhere near the crazy lady. She looked like she expected to be killed before she could even get a single spoonful into Sarah's mouth. Even Wallace stayed at a safe distance, settling for barking orders and calling his staff incompetent instead of helping. I finally cut through the noise and told them to just hand the bowl to me. The maid practically shoved the bowl into my hands like it was a ticking bomb, her expression instantly shifting to pure relief. I took the medicine and told everyone to leave the room so I could look after her myself. Wallace tried to object, but I shut him down before he could get a word out. I reminded him that she was my wife and that it was my responsibility to care for her. Then I told him to get out and close the door behind him. Wallace was livid, his face twisting in anger as he told me to suit myself if I had a death wish. He warned me not to come crying to them when that lunatic finally snapped and finished me off. The second the door clicked shut behind the butler and his maids, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to the bathroom and dumped the entire bowl of medicine down the toilet. I had caught a whiff of it the moment the bowl entered the room. Hidden beneath the heavy scent of herbs was a faint, sickly sour odor that shouldn't have been there. That specific stench belonged to a rare plant known as miasma vine. It is a toxic weed found only in the most isolated corners of Southeast Asia. Prolonged exposure to it causes severe mental instability and eventually leads to a total physical and mental collapse. It can be lethal, yet almost nobody in this country would even know what to look for. It was becoming clear that the rot within the Hamilton family went much deeper than I had initially suspected. It took another 30 minutes before Sarah finally ran out of energy and collapsed onto the bed. I calmly walked over to check her pulse, and it confirmed everything I had feared. The poison had already progressed significantly. Without the right intervention, she wouldn't last another month. Looking down at Sarah, I had to admit she was strikingly beautiful. She was the kind of woman men would ruin themselves over just to catch her eye. It was heartbreaking to see what they had turned her into. Her wrists and ankles were raw and bleeding, covered in ugly sores from her desperate struggles against the heavy iron chains. I pulled out the keys I had swiped from Wallace's pocket earlier and unlocked her shackles one by one. Once she was free, I carefully placed a neutralizing pill in her mouth. As I examined her further, my fingers brushed against something cold and metallic at the base of her skull. With a steady hand, I pulled out a long, thin silver needle that had been hidden there. Sarah let out a low moan of pain and furrowed her brow, but almost immediately, some color began to return to her cheeks. The needle itself was tarnished and blackened by the toxins it had been leaching. It was obvious the needle had been embedded in her skull for a long time. Whoever had done this was truly a monster. I adjusted her position so she could finally get some real rest, carefully tucking the blankets around her so she would stay warm. Later that evening, a servant brought up several sets of clothes. They were all designer labels, though clearly not from the premium collections the Hamiltons usually favored. I picked out a decent-looking shirt, took a quick shower, and changed. By the time I walked back into the room, I looked like a completely different man. Mr. Wallace decided to pay me a visit, barging into the room without even bothering to knock. It was a blatant sign of how little respect he had for me. I gave him a cold look and reminded him to knock next time he wanted to enter my room. He just brushed me off and cut me mid-sentence. Young Master Leo is back from school, he told me. He heard we have a new guest and wants to see what you're all about. When he saw I wasn't moving from the sofa or even closing my book, his tone got a lot more insistent. I leaned back and told him that if my new brother-in-law wanted to meet me, he could walk his own legs over here. I wasn't about to go running to greet a kid. Wallace actually laughed at that, telling me it was one thing to act high and mighty with the staff, but quite another to ignore someone like Leo. He reminded me that Leo was the Hamiltons' only son and the rightful heir to the house. He couldn't believe I had the nerve to expect the boy to come to me. I just turned the page of my book and told him that if the kid didn't want to come, that was fine by me. I wasn't exactly dying to meet him either. Wallace broke into a loud laugh and said that if I wanted to play games, I should be prepared for what Leo would do to me. He warned me that Leo was the biggest brat in the family and that nobody ever dared to cross him. He stormed out of the room in a huff, and only then did I finally close my book and stand up. It wasn't because of the butler's empty threats. It was because I noticed that Sarah had finally opened her eyes. Her eyes were still a bit foggy, but for the first time, she wasn't screaming or thrashing around. She was perfectly still. She stared blankly at the ceiling for a few minutes before her eyes slowly drifted over to where I was standing. I asked her if she wanted to sit up for a bit since she'd been in bed so long. Sarah didn't say a word or even flinch. She was like a limp doll, letting me guide her to the edge of the bed so she could sit upright. Looking at her, I felt a sense of quiet accomplishment. Her recovery was on track, even if she was still a bit out of it. I knew she'd be back to her old self soon enough if I just gave her time. Wallace, who was already looking for a reason to ruin me, wasted no time running to Henry to stir up trouble. He exaggerated every little detail, and predictably, Henry flew into a blind rage. The kid actually thought he was doing me a favor by wanting to meet. He couldn't believe I had the audacity to tell him I wasn't interested. He was offended that I was already acting like I was part of the family. Usually, he avoided the fifth floor like the plague. Sarah had always been icy and arrogant toward him even before she got sick. Once she lost her mind, she became even more frightening to him. He usually stayed away, but today his ego was bruised and he was seeing red. Henry threw the door open and came storming into the room. He was ready to pick a fight, but he stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Sarah sitting calmly on the edge of the bed. He stuttered her name, clearly shocked to see her awake. They had never been close, and he had no idea what was actually going on with her health. The moment Wallace saw her sitting up, his first instinct was that she was about to have another violent outburst. But then he noticed the chains were missing, and he turned pale as a ghost right there in the doorway. He stammered, asking how the hell her chains had been opened, while frantically patting his pockets for the keys. When he realized they were gone, I dangled the keys in front of his face and asked if he was looking for them. I told him he'd dropped them earlier. I explained that I wasn't about to leave my wife in chains when her skin was already raw and bleeding. Wallace's face turned a deep, angry shade of purple as he shouted about how I had no right to unlock her. I played dumb and told him that my wife wasn't a criminal, so there was no reason for her to be chained up like one. Wallace was frantic, asking if I had any idea how dangerous she was. He said everyone was already terrified of her when she was tied up, and that having her loose was insane. The mere thought of one of Sarah's fits had him ready to run for his life. He grabbed Henry by the arm and tried to pull him toward the door. He warned Henry that she wouldn't even recognize her own family once she snapped. But Henry was too busy being pissed at me to care about the danger. He was still fuming over being ignored. He just scoffed and asked what the big deal was about his sister waking up anyway. He told me she was still a lunatic and that I was delusional if I thought she'd protect me. He made it clear that my presence here was nothing more than a superstitious ritual his dad believed in. He laughed at the idea of a good luck wedding curing her. He told me the family looked at me as nothing more than a glorified male nurse for his sister. As he was talking, his eyes drifted toward the designer shopping bags sitting on the chair. Wallace quickly added that Mrs. Hamilton had ordered those clothes because she was embarrassed by how cheap my own stuff looked. Henry gave a nasty little smirk and said that a servant had no business wearing high-end clothes, accusing his mom of being too generous. He turned to Wallace and told him he could take the clothes for his son's upcoming birthday instead. Wallace's eyes practically sparkled. He knew those designer pieces were worth a small fortune on the resale market. He wanted to grab them, but was too scared of Sarah, so he had the nerve to tell me to bring the bags over to him. I gave him a blank look, picked up the bags, and even tucked back in a couple of items that had started to slide out. Wallace reached out with a smug grin, but I spun around and dropped the bags right into Sarah's lap instead. Henry's face darkened instantly as he demanded to know what I was doing. I told him calmly that since he wanted them so badly, I wouldn't stand in his way. However, I pointed out that as Sarah's husband, I needed her permission before giving her things away. Henry just laughed and asked how a crazy person was supposed to give permission. Since I wouldn't hand them over, he decided to just snatch them himself. He started lunging toward us, and even Wallace tried to hold him back. But Henry was oblivious to the danger, muttering that I shouldn't try to hide behind his sister. Before he could finish his sentence, a loud crack echoed through the room. A hand had struck him right across the face. Henry froze, his head whipping back and forth between me and Sarah, who still had that blank stare. He gasped, asking how I dared to hit him. I just looked at him with total innocence and told him his sister was the one who did it. I turned to Sarah and sighed, jokingly scolding her for hitting her own brother over something as silly as a few shirts. Sarah's eyes were only half open, looking distant and hollow. From where Henry was standing, he couldn't read her expression at all. He looked at the butler for confirmation, but Wallace just stood there with a twitching lip, admitting it had happened too fast for him to see. Henry wasn't about to let it go, but as he opened his mouth to scream at me, his knees suddenly buckled. He collapsed onto the floor, kneeling right at my feet. I couldn't help but let out a laugh. I told him that while he should technically show me some respect as his brother-in-law, kneeling was a bit much for the 21st century. I glanced over at Sarah and told her to go easy on him since he was family after all. Henry was shaking with pure rage, but Wallace was the first to snap out of it, quickly grabbing the boy and pulling him away. He whispered to Henry that something was very wrong with Sarah today and that they should leave while they could. He promised there'd be plenty of time to get back at me later. Henry didn't need much convincing. He was already too spooked to try anything else. The pain in his knee had faded into a cold numbness that was quickly spreading down his entire leg. He couldn't even stand on his own, so he had to let Wallace half-carry him out of the room. The whole ordeal didn't bother me in the slightest. I helped Sarah lie back down and gave her another dose of a neutralizer. Within minutes, she was fast asleep again. I looked at her and whispered that I hoped she wouldn't be mad about me hitting her brother. I joked that if she was, I might just have to make her crazy again. Her eyelashes fluttered for a second, almost as if she had heard me, but then she settled back into a deep sleep. Henry was dying to tattle on me, but his father was out of town on business, and his mother, Leesery, was nowhere to be found. He had nobody to back him up. His leg was still completely numb, and panicking that he was permanently paralyzed, he demanded Wallace take him to the ER immediately. The doctors ran every test in the book and found absolutely nothing wrong. By the next morning, the feeling in his leg had returned as mysteriously as it had vanished. Meanwhile, Leesery had been out all night playing cards and didn't find out her son was in the hospital until dawn. She came rushing into the room in a panic. When she heard that Sarah was responsible for it, her entire demeanor changed instantly. She demanded to know if this meant Sarah was finally coming to her senses. She gave Wallace a deadly look and reminded him that while Henry might be clueless, Wallace should have known better than to let the boy up to the 5th floor. She shut down his excuses before he could even start. She told him that seeing his master in such a state was proof enough of his failure. She told him his bonus for the month was gone and warned him that one more mistake would be his last in this house. Once she was done with Wallace, she turned her frustration toward her son, asking him why he never listened when she told him to stay away from the top floor. She told him there was nothing to see but a lunatic who wouldn't hesitate to hurt her own family. She said he was lucky to have escaped with just a scare this time. Instead of the sympathy he wanted, Henry just got another lecture, which only made him even more resentful. He muttered that he didn't care about his sister. He just wanted to see the loser who was pathetic enough to marry a crazy woman for a quick paycheck. Leesery told him that the husband was a nobody who wasn't worth his time. She confessed that Dr. Evans had already confirmed his sister wouldn't last more than a month anyway. Henry was shocked by the news of Sarah's impending death. Leesery realized she'd said too much, but she didn't seem particularly bothered by it. She told him to keep it quiet and explained that his father was just acting out of guilt, wanting her to have a husband so she wouldn't die alone. She promised they'd find a way to toss me out on the street once Sarah was gone. Knowing that I was temporary finally made Henry feel a little better. The weather was perfect the next day, mild and pleasant. Even Sarah seemed to be looking a little healthier than before. When I fed her breakfast, she was actually cooperative for once. Her eyes stayed fixed on me, and they seemed a lot more focused than they had the day before. I helped her into her wheelchair and asked if she wanted to go outside. She didn't answer, but she slowly turned her gaze toward the window. I took that as a yes. I told her we were going for a walk in the garden and that the fresh air would do her some good. It had been 3 years since Sarah had left that room. As I pushed her out into the hallway, the staff stopped what they were doing and stared as if they were seeing a ghost. Wallace looked like he wanted to stop us, but he was too intimidated to move. Instead, he reached for his phone and called Leesery. Leesery's voice over the phone was ice cold as she told him to stay put. She said she was on her way and ordered him to get Dr. Evans to the mansion immediately. Leesery's original plan was to pay me off once Sarah died, provided I stayed out of the way. But now she was starting to realize that getting rid of me wasn't going to be as simple as she thought. I hadn't expected that a simple walk in the garden would provoke so much hostility from the family. I reached out to brush a stray petal from Sarah's hair and noticed a flicker of deep sadness in her eyes as she looked at the flowers. I assumed she was mourning the years she'd lost, so I told her to let the past go. I promised her that she'd be back to her old self before she knew it. I told her to think of the last 3 years as nothing more than a long bad dream. She slowly looked up and met my eyes. Her lips trembled as she struggled to speak, finally whispering that she would try to get better soon. The peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. A group of people came stomping down the path toward us. Leesery didn't even wait to get close before she started screaming about who gave me permission to bring Sarah outside. She reminded me that she had warned me to stay in my place and accused me of ignoring everything she said. She turned to Wallace and barked orders to get Sarah back to her room and to take me down to the laundry. She decided that since I couldn't follow rules, I'd spend my days cleaning every single pair of shoes in the mansion. Wallace, emboldened by Leesery's presence, didn't hesitate to step forward and tell me that Sarah needed to go back inside. He told me to follow him to the laundry and reached out to grab my arm. Before he could touch me, I swept his ankle with my foot. He stumbled blindly and went face first into the dirt. I moved so fast that nobody even saw what happened. They all just assumed the clumsy old man had tripped over his own feet. I knelt down and pretended to be worried, asking if he was okay and telling him he really should watch where he was going. Wallace spat out a mouthful of grass and was ready to start swearing, but before he could, his eyes rolled back and he passed out cold. While I was helping him up, I had actually pressed a specific nerve point that knocked him out instantly. It was the same thing I'd done to Henry's leg the night before. I had just temporarily blocked the nerve signals with a well-placed strike. Not many people know how to manipulate pressure points anymore, and even fewer have actually mastered the art like I have. Leesery was stunned that a simple fall had knocked her butler out. She was already thinking about whether it was time to replace him with someone more competent. She muttered that the family didn't need a butler who couldn't even walk. She turned to her bodyguard and ordered him to get Sarah back upstairs immediately. The bodyguard was a massive guy who went by Big Mike. He was built like a tank and looked like he enjoyed breaking people for fun. Word was he was a former kickboxing champ who could take on a whole room of guys at once. Leesery paid him a fortune to be her personal muscle. Back when Sarah's episodes first started, she was already in chains, and everyone was too terrified to even go near her. Big Mike was the one who had finally overpowered her and locked her into those shackles. She hadn't been free of them for 3 years until I arrived. Seeing him again made Sarah's whole body tense up. If she had been strong enough, I'm sure she would have tried to rip him apart right then and there. Big Mike stepped toward her and muttered a hollow apology. He pulled out a fresh set of iron cuffs, fully intending to lock her down again. I stepped in front of Sarah's wheelchair before he could get anywhere near her. My voice was low and calm as I told him to stop. I reminded him that under American law, nobody has the right to illegally imprison someone or restrict their freedom without cause. I asked him if he knew that breaking the law was a one-way ticket to being deported. Big Mike actually hesitated for a second when he heard that. He looked over at Leesery for guidance. She just laughed and told him not to listen to me. She reminded me that we were on Hamilton property and told me I was being ridiculous for trying to talk about the law in her house. She asked me who I thought I was. I didn't back down, telling her that no matter how big their mansion was, it was still subject to the laws of this country. I told her that being inside her own house didn't give her a pass to break the law. I reminded her that everyone is expected to be a law-abiding citizen. As I was speaking, I pulled out my phone and started recording. I told her I could see the headline already. Hamilton heiress imprisoned by evil stepmother for 3 years. I warned her that if a video like that went viral, the police would be the least of her worries. The public backlash would destroy her. Leesery was shaking with rage, unable to believe I was threatening her. She yelled at Big Mike to quit standing there and take my phone away. She ordered him to make sure I never used a phone again. Big Mike lunged forward, his massive hand reaching for my device. My gaze went cold as I met his move. My fist collided with his palm, and the force of the impact sent him stumbling back 3 steps. He stared at his hand in shock as a wave of numbness surged up his arm. He couldn't believe I had that kind of power. He saw something in my eyes that terrified him. It was the look of a man who had seen real combat, not someone playing around in a gym. It was the look of a survivor who had been to hell and back. I spoke in a low, even tone. I asked him how long he'd been living in the U.S. while I reached up to touch the pendant on my necklace. Hidden inside was a tiny camera that was already streaming every second of this encounter to a secure server. Whether it was the punch or the look in my eyes, something finally got through to him. He mumbled that he'd been here for 5 years. I told him I hoped he'd managed to save up some money in that time. I warned him that if he wanted to keep making a living here, he'd better start following the law. Otherwise, he'd find himself on a flight back home before he knew it. Miles away, in a secure control room, a stone-faced man was watching the feed. He picked up his radio and ordered his team to find everything they could on an illegal immigrant named Big Mike. He wanted him gone. Leesery was staying well back, still terrified that Sarah might snap. She hadn't even realized that I'd just held my own against her best man. She assumed Big Mike was just being soft on me because I was technically part of the family. She started screaming at him again. She asked him if he'd forgotten who signed his paychecks. She ordered him to stop wasting time and just take me out already. Big Mike's instincts were screaming at him to stay away, but Leesery was still the one paying the bills. He figured he could handle a little legal trouble if it kept his boss happy. He was sure the Hamiltons could make any problem disappear. He let out a low, animalistic growl as he charged. He threw a punch with enough force to put a hole in a brick wall. He wasn't holding back this time. He grunted that I'd brought this on myself as his fist flew toward me. Sarah couldn't see the fight from her wheelchair, but she could sense the tension and the danger I was in. She tried to stand up to help, but her legs were still uselessly numb. As she started to panic, she heard a dull thud behind her. Just as the punch was about to land, I noticed my shoelace was untied. I leaned down to fix it, accidentally causing his massive fist to sail harmlessly over my head. His punch slammed into the tree behind me with a sickening crack. The impact sent a shower of cherry blossoms raining down on us like pink snow. My casual demeanor vanished instantly. I moved like a blur, striking 4 times in a fraction of a second. I hit the nerve centers in his arms and legs with clinical precision. By the time the last pedal hit the ground, Leesery could finally see what had happened. Big Mike was on his knees, frozen in place. His arms were locked above his head in what looked like a bizarre surrender pose. Leesery was absolutely livid at the sight of her bodyguard kneeling like a child. She screamed at him, demanding to know what the hell he was doing. She yelled that she paid him to take me out, not to bow down to me. Big Mike finally realized who he was dealing with. He knew now that I was no ordinary guy and that he was completely outmatched. He tried to speak, but I placed a hand on his shoulder and cut him off. I spoke in a calm, steady voice. I asked him what he'd done to upset my wife, jokingly suggesting that his kneeling was an apology. I told him I'd accept it on her behalf. He tried to argue, but he realized he couldn't make a sound. When I patted his shoulder, I'd hit a pressure point that temporarily paralyzed his vocal cords. Leesery spat a few more insults at him before pulling out her phone to call in the rest of the security team. But before she could dial, her phone rang. It was the head of security, and he sounded absolutely terrified. He told her the police were at the front gate with a warrant for Big Mike's arrest. Apparently, someone had called in an anonymous tip about him being involved in illegal solicitation. If the charges stuck, he'd be deported for sure. Leesery was so angry, she looked like she was about to have a stroke. She cursed him for being an idiot and wondered if she'd been overpaying him. She had no idea how much worse it was going to get for him. He'd been to that club 100 times before without any issues. He couldn't understand why someone had finally decided to report him now. He knew his career was over. Once he had a record, nobody would ever hire him for a high-paying gig like this again. The police eventually hauled him away. The effects of the pressure point wouldn't wear off for at least 24 hours. I brushed the remaining petals off Sarah and told her it was time to head back inside and rest. I completely ignored Leesery the entire time, which only made her more furious. She was shaking with rage, but there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop me. Dr. Evans finally showed up and immediately started questioning why Sarah was out of her room. Leesery noticed that Sarah looked better and barked at the doctor to give her a full exam immediately. Dr. Evans introduced himself as Sarah's personal physician. He claimed he was there to follow up after her incident the previous day. I didn't even wait for him to finish before I started pushing Sarah's wheelchair back toward the house. He was clearly embarrassed, but he didn't give up, following us and offering to take over pushing the wheelchair. Before he could even lay a finger on the handle, I spun around and slapped him right across the face. He stood there clutching his cheek with a look of pure shock. I told him that if I wouldn't listen to Leesery, I certainly wasn't going to listen to her lapdog. I asked him why he thought I'd given the time of day when he was nothing more than a puppet. I warned him to stay out of my way if he knew what was good for him. Leesery had sent him to check on Sarah and see exactly how much longer she had left. Despite the slap, he tried to maintain his professional facade. He claimed that as a doctor, it was his duty to treat her and accused me of having some hidden agenda for stopping him. I just laughed at him, calling him out for trying to flip the script and make me look like the bad guy. I pointed out that she had only gotten worse under his care and asked him how he could even call himself a doctor. I called him a pathetic hack to his face. He looked like he'd just seen a ghost. He asked me what I meant by that, but I just gave him a cold smile. I told him a real doctor's job is to save people, not to sell their soul for a paycheck, and warned him that karma was coming for him. I didn't wait for a response. I just turned the wheelchair around and left him standing there in the middle of the path. Evans stood frozen to the spot, wondering if I actually knew the truth about what they were doing to Sarah. He didn't waste any time running back to Leesery to tell her exactly what I had said. He told her that Sarah looked significantly healthier and warned her that if it wasn't a sudden rally before the end, then they were in trouble. Leesery was speechless, unable to believe that I might actually be healing her. Evans told her it was too early to say for sure, but since Sarah was already on her deathbed, an overnight recovery shouldn't have been possible. He admitted he was worried about what I'd do if she died. Leesery just slammed her hand on the table and gave a mockingly cold laugh. She scoffed at the idea of a nobody like me being able to do anything to a family as powerful as the Hamiltons. But despite her brave words, she was clearly worried. She wished she had never let me into the house in the first place. She muttered that she was going to throw me out the second Sarah stopped breathing. She hated that I was acting like I actually belonged there. She decided she couldn't wait for nature to take its course and that she needed to speed things up. The servants kept bringing up more medicine throughout the day, but I made sure none of it ever touched Sarah's lips. I was personally inspecting every tray of food they brought her to make sure they hadn't slipped anything into her meals. I didn't let her eat a single bite until I was sure it was safe. That night, I gave her another dose of my own medicine, and she looked even better the next morning. Her speech was still a little slurred, but I told her not to worry. I reminded her that she'd been sick for a long time and that her recovery would take patience. I tucked her in and told her to get some rest. She was out almost immediately, and I spent another night on the sofa. I took her out for another walk the next morning. I knew that fresh air and a change of scenery were just as important as the medicine for her mental health. We had just stepped into the elevator when the lights flickered and then died completely, leaving us in total darkness. I tried the emergency button, but it was dead. When I checked my phone, I saw I had no service at all. It was clear that someone was jamming the signal. This wasn't a simple power failure. It was deliberate. Leesery had decided she couldn't risk any more delays and was moving forward with her plan for a convenient accident. For most people, being stuck in a dark elevator for a few hours would be a minor inconvenience. But for someone in Sarah's condition, the psychological strain could be devastating and might push her over the edge. She was already in a fragile state, and each new episode was taking a toll on her health that she couldn't afford. Meanwhile, Leesery was downstairs in the living room, calmly sipping her coffee with a smug smile on her face. She thought I was a fool for believing a few walks in the garden would heal her. She laughed at the idea of me trying to use Sarah as my protector. Wallace came over with a greasy smile and asked how much longer they were going to leave us stuck in there. Leesery just took another sip and told him that there was no rush. She mockingly suggested that since I was so talented, I should just fix the elevator and climb out myself. She didn't care which one of us got hurt. She was just hoping for a tragic outcome for both of us. Her little celebration was cut short when Richard Hamilton, Sarah's father, unexpectedly walked through the front door after being away for 2 weeks. Leesery was caught completely off guard. She rushed over to greet him, asking why he was back so much earlier than planned. Richard was a notorious playboy in the city. He'd spent most of his adult life chasing one woman after another. Aside from his talent for seduction, he was pretty much useless. It was why Sarah's grandfather had been so worried about the future of the family empire. He'd bypassed his own son entirely and handed the keys to the Hamilton Group over to his granddaughter instead. Leesery was used to his wandering eye and didn't really care as long as her lifestyle and position in the family remained secure. Richard explained that he'd come back because she had told him Sarah's condition was worsening. He said he wanted to see his daughter and asked where she was. He also asked about the new husband and whether my presence had actually helped her at all. Without waiting for an answer, Richard started heading upstairs. Despite his many faults, he did actually care about his daughter in his own way. He had a soft spot for Sarah, mostly because she was the daughter of the only woman he'd ever truly loved. She was also clearly the brightest of all his kids. Even in her current state, he still felt a connection to her. Leesery's eyes narrowed as she began to spin her web of lies. She told him not to start with the sentimental stuff. She blamed him for the whole good luck marriage idea and called me a curse who was making things worse. She accused me of dragging Sarah out into the cold and hinted that I was trying to kill her so I could take the money and run. Richard was furious. He demanded to know why Leesery was just standing by and letting me treat his daughter that way. Leesery played the victim, claiming she tried to stop me, but that I had absolutely no respect for her authority. Right on cue, a servant came running in, breathless and sounding frantic. He told them that I had insisted on taking Sarah out and that something had gone wrong. He reported that the elevator had broken down and that we were both trapped inside. Leesery put on her best shocked face. She cried out about how fragile Sarah was and accused me of being responsible for the entire mess. She barked orders at the staff to get the elevator open before Sarah had a complete breakdown. Richard was panicking too, demanding to know which floor we were on. When he heard it was the 5th, he went racing up the stairs. Since the elevator was dead, everyone was forced to take the stairs. Richard was out of breath as he yelled for the maintenance crew. A servant told him the crew was off for the day, but that they'd been called and were on their way. I knew that Leesery had deliberately sent the maintenance crew home just to make sure we stayed stuck as long as possible. Richard was banging on the elevator doors, shouting for Sarah to hang in there and promising that help was on the way. It was dead silent inside the elevator. Leesery started whispering about how quiet it was and wondering if we were running out of air. She wondered aloud if Sarah had already passed out. Richard was frantic now, ordering them to just pry the doors open. One of the staff warned him that prying the doors open without a pro could cause the elevator car to drop, killing everyone inside. Right at that moment, a calm voice spoke up from behind them, asking why everyone was crowding around the elevator. Leesery whipped around and stared in shock. I was standing right there in the hallway, looking perfectly fine and acting like I had no idea what the fuss was about. I gave him a small smile and asked if they were waiting for the elevator, then casually reached out and pressed the button. The door slid open perfectly, showing an empty car. Richard just stood there, completely bewildered. He stammered, asking if the elevator wasn't supposed to be broken, then turned to ask who I was. Leesery spat out that I was the new husband he'd arranged. She gave him a nasty look before turning her anger on me, demanding to know how I wasn't trapped in the elevator with Sarah. She accused me of hiding and trying to scare everyone while they were frantic with worry. I played it cool, admitting that the elevator had gotten stuck for a minute and that the emergency phone wasn't working. I told them that when we finally got out, the hallway was empty, so I'd assumed they didn't even know there was a problem. Richard's temper boiled over. He screamed at the staff, asking if I was telling the truth, and how they could be so incompetent as to not know people were trapped in their own home. The servants all looked at the floor, too terrified to mention that Leesery had told them specifically to ignore the elevator. I just shrugged and said we must have gotten lucky, claiming the thing just started working again on its own. Of course, I knew exactly what had happened. I had pried the doors open myself and fixed the wiring while I was at it. Richard finally relaxed a bit and asked if Sarah was okay. He muttered that maybe I really was a good luck charm after all. I gave him a polite smile and assured him that his daughter was doing just fine. Leesery wasn't about to let me off the hook that easily. She started yelling again about how it was all my fault for taking Sarah out in the first place. She called me reckless and said that if anything had happened to Sarah, my life wouldn't have been enough to pay for it. She could see Richard was getting angry again, so she decided to keep pushing. She told him that I had refused to let Dr. Evans examine Sarah the day before, acting like a total lunatic myself. She hinted that I was deliberately trying to make Sarah's condition worse for my own selfish reasons. Richard's face was red with rage. He called me irresponsible and said he couldn't believe I would actually try to harm his daughter. Leesery drove the point home, saying that the family couldn't afford to have someone like me around, and that I'd eventually be the death of Sarah. Richard's voice was like ice as he told me I wasn't fit for the family and ordered me to leave. He said he'd find someone else to take my place. I didn't budge. I looked him in the eye and told him that as Sarah's legal husband, I wasn't going anywhere unless she was the one who asked for a divorce. Leesery was shocked by my defiance. She snapped that it wasn't my choice and ordered the staff to call security to have me thrown out. Suddenly, a sharp, cold voice cut through the room, demanding to know who dared to touch her husband. Everyone froze in shock. The bedroom door opened, and Sarah slowly wheeled herself out into the hallway. She was still pale, but her presence was entirely different. Her eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were sharp and focused. Her stare was cold enough to freeze the room. Leesery's heart skipped a beat. She knew the real Sarah was back. The formidable woman who could command a room without saying a word was standing before them. Richard looked like he was about to burst with joy. He tried to rush to her, calling her name, but she just gave him a cold, dismissive look and said it had been a long time. Richard was too happy to notice the sarcasm in her voice and tried to hug her, but she skillfully wheeled herself out of his reach. She looked straight at Leesery and asked if she was really trying to throw her husband out of the house. Leesery had always been intimidated by her, and now she was stammering, unable to find the right words. Sarah turned her attention to the servants, calling them out for failing to handle a simple elevator glitch. She told them they were useless and ordered them all to be paid off and gone by the end of the day. Every single servant in the house was loyal to Leesery. With one sentence, Sarah had fired them all. Before Leesery could even open her mouth to object, Richard was already nodding in agreement, saying they could start over with a new staff as long as it made Sarah happy. Leesery had no choice but to go back to her fake concern, asking Sarah how she felt and offering to call Dr. Evans. Sarah just laughed and called him a fraud. She told Leesery she wasn't just done with him. She was planning on seeing him behind bars. She warned them that just because she'd been sick didn't mean she was blind to everything they had done to her. Richard suggested they go to the hospital for a full checkup, but Sarah cut him off before he could finish. She impatiently told me it was time to go back to our room. I didn't hesitate. I just pushed her wheelchair right back inside. I closed the door behind us, cutting off all the staring eyes. I asked her why she'd come out when she wasn't fully recovered yet. In truth, Sarah was doing much better than I let on. Her speech was clear, and she could even manage a few steps on her own. She still needed a few more days before she could walk normally. She told me she just couldn't stand by and watch them try to push me around. She thanked me for saving her and told me that she'd give me anything I wanted as a reward. After spending a few days with me, she had already realized I wasn't just some random guy. She knew I had my own reasons for being in the mansion, but none of that mattered to her. I had saved her life and restored her dignity. I gave her a small smile, finding her serious expression almost adorable. I decided to tease her a bit and asked if anything included her as well. I tilted her chin up and told her that she was pretty enough in a joking way. Even though she knew I was joking, she still turned bright red. She looked away and whispered a quiet, "Okay." She told me that if I wanted, I could be the one in charge of our lives from now on. She promised to be a devoted wife and to honor me for the rest of her life. I raised an eyebrow and asked if that meant there was no room for actual love in our marriage. She looked genuinely pained as she apologized, telling me she had already given her heart to someone else years ago. She explained that another boy had saved her once and that she had been looking for him ever since. She said she knew it sounded ungrateful, but she'd rather be honest than lie to me. She told me she'd give me anything else, even her life, but her heart already belonged to him. I laughed it off, telling her that since Morrison was only here for a mission anyway, a loveless marriage suited me just fine. I agreed to the arrangement, telling her we could just stay married on paper until she found her long-lost hero. Her eyes flickered with a strange emotion, but she promised that she would never do anything to betray our marriage as long as we were together. She said she just needed closure and told me that the only reason she'd ever let me go was if I found someone I actually loved. She promised that nobody could ever force me to leave her. Then, her expression turned somber. She admitted that she'd been looking for him for years to no avail. Everyone told her he was probably dead, but she refused to believe it. She said she could still feel him out there somewhere, just waiting to be found. I gave her a reassuring grin and told her I'd help her find him. I promised her that if I set my mind to it, I could find anyone on the planet. She clearly thought I was just bragging and moved the conversation back to her health, noting that she still needed a few days to fully recover. I told her she'd be walking again by tomorrow, or the day after at the very latest. I reminded her that after 3 years of being bedridden, she needed to take it slow and not push herself too hard. I could tell she was already thinking about getting even, so I told her that revenge could wait. I told her we both knew Leesery was likely the one behind it, and that taking her down would be easy enough when the time was right. Sarah gave a cold laugh and said Leesery was too stupid to be the mastermind. She called her a mere tool and said she already had plenty of ways to handle her. She said she wanted Leesery to suffer as much as she had over the last 3 years. Anything less wouldn't be justice. Her voice was calm, but the underlying rage was unmistakable. I remembered reading in her file that she was a woman who never forgot a grudge. She was known for being ruthless and ensuring that anyone who crossed her paid a heavy price. By evening, Richard came up himself to invite Sarah down to join the family for dinner. He told her that her brother and sister-in-law had flown in from Chicago just to see her, and that even Faye had returned home. He joked that she was more popular than him, noting that nobody ever made such a fuss when he came home. Sarah didn't hold back, reminding him that he only ever came home to ask for money before running off to find another woman. She never spared his feelings, and Richard could only give a sheepish laugh in response. He asked her to at least try to show him some respect in front of outsiders. I just raised an eyebrow at that. I asked if he was talking about me, but before he could answer, I felt Sarah's hand slip into mine. She looked up at me with a soft smile and told him that as her husband, I was now her closest relative. Richard looked a bit annoyed by the public display of affection. He complained that she had never given him a smile like that in her entire life. He grumbled about her being so sweet to a man she'd only known for a few days, then told us to just hurry down to dinner. As soon as the door closed, Sarah warned me that her father was selfish and wouldn't hesitate to turn on me if it suited him. She told me his outsider comment was a test, and that if she hadn't defended me, he would have come after me next. I told her he could try, but I wasn't worried. She said she knew I could handle myself, but she just didn't want me to have to deal with unnecessary drama. By the time we made it down to the dining room, everyone was already seated. Her brother, Caleb, was the first to speak. He told Sarah she looked great and said he was genuinely happy to see her doing so well. He turned to me with a polite smile, apologizing for being away on business and missing our wedding. He signaled to his wife, Olivia, who produced a small red velvet box. She told me it was a wedding gift and hoped I'd like it. I opened the box to find a diamond-encrusted watch. To anyone else, it would have looked incredibly expensive and impressive. But I knew better. I could tell instantly that the diamonds were low-quality junk. The watch was a flashy piece of garbage that wasn't worth much at all. I didn't call them out on it, but I didn't act overly impressed either. I just gave them a simple thanks and told them they shouldn't have bothered. Olivia kept smiling, but I could tell she was looking down on me, thinking I was just some clueless country boy. Henry was sitting nearby with his dog, watching us from across the room. He couldn't tell the watch was fake and started complaining about how Caleb and Olivia were giving me gifts instead of him. Caleb laughed and told him he was too old to be begging for presents, promising that Olivia would pick something out for him the next day. I decided to chime in and told Henry that if he liked the watch so much, he was more than welcome to have it. Henry looked surprised that I was being so generous. I pulled the watch out of the box and walked right over to him. Henry assumed I was just trying to look good in front of the family and reached out to take it. But I pulled back at the last second and strapped the watch onto his puppy's paw instead. I told him it looked like a perfect fit. Henry was ready to start screaming until he actually looked at the watch. He saw how cheap the diamonds really were and burst out laughing, mocking Olivia for giving me such a pathetic fake. He joked that it actually looked pretty good on the dog. Sarah's voice suddenly cut through the room like a knife. She asked Caleb if that was really the best he could do for her husband. She accused him of disrespecting her by giving her husband a cheap knockoff the second she was back on her feet. Olivia looked like she wanted to crawl into a hole and die. It was one thing to be caught with a fake, but it was another to have it literally given to a dog. She started to stutter out an excuse, but Caleb jumped in and claimed that Olivia must have been scammed by the jeweler. He promised to give me something better tomorrow, but Sarah just told him not to bother. She said my standards were too high for them to ever satisfy. She suggested that if they were actually sincere, they should just give me the cash value instead. I didn't miss a beat, giving them my account number at Evergreen Credit Union. I told them a wire transfer would be easiest and joked about saving them the processing fees since I knew they were so worried about money. Olivia was absolutely miserable. She couldn't believe how brazen we were being, demanding cash instead of a gift. But Caleb didn't even flinch, asking if $1 million would be enough. Olivia looked like she was having a heart attack at the mention of that much money. She kept shooting him looks, trying to tell him that $100,000 was more than enough for a decent gift. I was having too much fun watching her squirm, so I decided to push her a little further. I told them that as a simple country boy, I had no idea what a good watch cost and wasn't sure if $1 million would even cover it. I suggested they just make it $2 million instead, unless Caleb thought that was too much for a family gift. Olivia looked like she was about to pass out. She couldn't believe I had the nerve to ask for $2 million. But Caleb didn't lose his cool. He said it was no problem at all as long as I was happy. He pulled out his phone and transferred the money right then and there. The second the notification pinged on my phone, everyone finally started eating. The new staff was already hard at work, making sure everything was perfect. Caleb noticed that every single person serving the meal was new. He realized Sarah had already replaced the entire staff. The topic clearly upset Lizuri. She muttered something about a stomach ache and excused herself from the table. Ever since Morrison, had arrived, nothing had gone right for her. Her best muscle had been deported, and now her entire domestic spy network had been dismantled. On top of that, Sarah had made a miraculous recovery, and her first move was to fire everyone Lizuri had spent years handpicking. Richard didn't even notice his wife's mood. He was too busy telling Caleb all about the miracle that had happened with the elevator earlier that day. Caleb just gave a smooth smile and said that firing the whole staff was exactly the kind of thing the old Sarah would do. He noted that her quick move to replace everyone was a fresh start for the entire household. Sarah told him that if she couldn't even manage her own household, she had no business running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. After dinner, I took Sarah back to her room and gave her another dose of my medicine. Sarah swallowed it without hesitation. She told me she trusted me completely but was curious about what exactly I was giving her. I gave her a mischievous grin and told her it was poison, but that it was a bit late to be asking after she'd been taking it for days. She looked at me and said that if I were the one giving it to her, she'd take it even if it were poison. I told her she was a fool for being so trusting. I asked her what she'd do if I had only saved her so I could use her for my own ends before getting rid of her. She told me I wouldn't need to waste any medicine if that were the case. She said I could just tell her what I wanted, even if it was her life. I couldn't help but laugh. I told her she was much more useful to me alive and explained that the medicine was a powerful detoxifier I had formulated myself. It was effective against a wide range of toxins, and I always kept a supply on me just in case I ran into trouble. I told her it had almost no side effects and that I'd used it to save dozens of people over the years. But I had to admit, out of all the people I'd helped, she was by far the most intriguing. I told her I want to talk about our living arrangements. I explained that I'd only been staying in her room to make sure nobody tried to hurt her while she was recovering. But now that she had her own people running the house, she was much safer. I suggested that maybe it was time for me to get my own room. I told her that sleeping on the sofa was starting to kill my back. She looked genuinely sorry and agreed that I deserved my own space. But she pointed out that if we moved into separate rooms, everyone would know our marriage was a sham. I had to admit she had a point. I suggested getting a high-end sofa bed instead. That way we could keep up appearances during the day without me having to sleep on a cramped couch at night. Sarah agreed and made the call. Within an hour, a top-of-the-line sofa bed was being delivered to our room. Her new team was incredibly efficient. It made me realize that if she hadn't been poisoned and incapacitated, she never would have let Lizuri and the others get away with treating her like that. I was about to climb onto the new bed when Sarah beat me to it. She told me she was taking the sofa bed and that I was going to sleep in the actual bed from now on. She wrapped herself in a blanket and told me to get some rest, wishing me a good night. I wasn't about to argue with that. I took the king-size bed and found it to be incredibly comfortable. I was out the second my head hit the pillow. It was probably the best sleep I'd had in years. Sarah had grown up in luxury and had never slept on anything less than a premium mattress in her life. She woke up in the middle of the night, unable to get comfortable on the sofa bed. As she started to roll over, she noticed me. She saw that I was thrashing around in my sleep, caught in the grip of a terrifying nightmare. I was mumbling for monsters to stay away and crying out for my mother. In that moment, the calm, collected man she knew from the daytime was gone. I looked like a scared child, curled into a ball and desperately calling out for my mom. Without me realizing it, Sarah had climbed into bed and pulled me into her arms. She whispered in my ear, telling me it was just a dream and that she was there to protect me. She didn't know anything about my past, but she could sense that I had been through something truly horrific. Her presence seemed to calm me down, and the nightmares finally faded away as I fell back into a deep, peaceful sleep. It took me a few seconds to realize where I was when I woke up the next morning. When I saw Sarah lying right next to me, I nearly jumped out of my skin. At some point during the night, she had crawled into the big bed and was currently hugging me like a teddy bear, snoring softly. My instincts took over, and I reflexively kicked her right off the side of the bed. She woke up on the floor and immediately started complaining about how I was trying to kill a defenseless patient. I demanded to know what the hell she was doing in my bed and if she tried anything while I was asleep. She just rolled her eyes and pointed out that I was still fully dressed. She joked that even if she wanted to try something, she knew better than to mess with someone like me. She explained that she'd only come over because I was having a nightmare and that she must have just drifted off while trying to calm me down. I took a second to calm down and double-check myself. Everything seemed to be exactly where it was supposed to be. My biggest fear was waking up and finding out I was going to be a father without even knowing how it happened. But I knew I would have noticed if anything had actually happened. The nightmares had been with me for as long as I could remember. It was a secret I kept from everyone, and I'd long since learned to live with it. I was annoyed that she'd seen me like that, but I told her I'd take her word for it this time. I made her promise never to tell a soul about what she saw. I told her to just ignore me if it happened again, and made it clear that no hugging was allowed. She just gave me a little smirk and promised my secret was safe with her. I asked her what she was so happy about and if she was making fun of me. She immediately straightened her face and swore she wasn't. I just sighed and threw my hands up. There was nothing more embarrassing than a guy losing his cool in front of a woman. We didn't make it down to breakfast until after 9. Henry came stumbling in, looking like he'd just crawled out of bed. As soon as he saw us, he froze. Sarah gave him a look that was cold enough to stop him in his tracks. Henry's appetite vanished instantly. He grabbed his bag and hurried out the door without saying a word. I started laughing, telling Sarah she'd just scared her brother out of breakfast with a single look. I told her I almost felt sorry for the kid. Sarah had never had any patience for her stepmother's side of the family and saw no reason to start now. She told me not to worry and that missing one meal wasn't going to kill him. I told her that now that she was mostly recovered, she didn't need me hovering over her every second of the day. She looked genuinely worried and asked if I was leaving. She reminded me that I'd promised to stay with her for a while. I realized she'd misunderstood me and gave her a reassuring smile. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. I just wanted to get out of the house and do some shopping. She looked visibly relieved and offered to come with me. I told her no, explaining that she wasn't quite strong enough for a day of shopping yet. Sarah nodded and handed me a sleek black card with gold trim. I stared at it, telling her it looked pretty fancy. Sarah told me it was a black card for Grandview Plaza and that I could use it to buy whatever I wanted. Grandview Plaza was the most exclusive mall in the city, the kind of place where celebrities shopped and the prices were astronomical. I asked her if she was serious about me being able to buy anything for free. I joked that she'd probably own the place. I'd heard that the owner of Grandview Plaza was incredibly private and left all the day-to-day operations to a CEO. Sarah admitted that she actually did own it. She said her grandfather had given her the seed money when she was 13 to see if she had a head for business. He'd told her she couldn't use any of the family's connections, so she had bought a vacant lot and built the mall from the ground up. The real estate market exploded shortly after, and the value of the land alone quadrupled. Once the mall was finished, it became a national landmark. She told me that the card I was holding was the only one of its kind in existence, and that I could literally buy everything in a mall with it if I wanted. I ignored her obvious pride and joked about whether she'd really be okay with me spending that much of her money. I burst out laughing and told her I wasn't that greedy, promising to only buy half the stores. I tucked the card into my pocket and left the mansion, humming a tune as I went. Sarah watched me go with a rare smile on her face. I made it to the mall in no time. I was walking past a high-end boutique when a shirt in the window caught my eye. I checked the tag and saw it was $58,000. Even without Sarah's money, I could have afforded it myself. I walked into the store and was ready to pay. Just then, my cousin, Tyler Miller, walked into the shop. He was the one who had originally refused to marry the crazy Sarah. He was with his friend, Ryan Scott, a guy from one of the city's wealthiest families. The Scotts were a big deal in New York. Tyler pointed out the shirt, excited to have found the limited edition piece they'd seen in a magazine. He said it looked even better in person and practically snatched it out of the clerk's hand. But once he saw the price tag, he immediately cooled off. The Millers were comfortable, but they weren't the kind of family that could drop 60 grand on a single shirt. Ryan liked the shirt too, but even for him, the price was a bit steep. He was a Scot, but as an illegitimate son, his monthly allowance was only $60,000. Spending his entire month's allowance on one shirt seemed a bit much even for him. That was when Tyler noticed me standing there. He called out my name in surprise, asking what a guy like me was doing in a store like this. I had been dressed pretty simply when I first moved into the mansion, but now I was wearing high-end clothes and looked like a completely different person. I told him I didn't see why me being at a mall was such a big deal. Tyler introduced me to Ryan as his cousin. He made sure to mention that I was the one who had been sold into a good-luck marriage. Ryan's expression immediately shifted to one of pure mockery. Ryan laughed and said he remembered hearing about the guy who sold himself for $200,000 to marry a lunatic heiress. He mocked me, saying it was no wonder I could afford to shop here after selling my soul to a wealthy family. I had taken $200,000 from my Uncle Frank, but that was only because it was the inheritance my parents had left me. I had only used the wedding as an excuse to get my money back, and I was disgusted by how Tyler was twisting the story. I told Tyler to hand over the shirt and warned him to stop acting like a big shot before he regretted it. He refused to give it back, reminding me that I hadn't paid for it yet. He accused me of being a thief for taking that money from his family. He told me I should start saving my money because once Sarah died, I'd be out on the street with nowhere to go. Before he could finish his sentence, I reached out and slapped him across the face so hard it left a bright red mark. I told him I must have gone too easy on him at the Miller house if he still thought he could talk to me like that. Tyler was shaking with rage, but he remembered the last time I'd thrown him across a room. He was too scared to actually try and hit me back. He looked at Ryan for help, but before either of them could do anything, I'd already snatched the shirt back out of Tyler's hand. I reminded him about first come, first served, and told him his mom should have taught him some manners. Ryan wasn't used to being talked to that way. He'd been treated like royalty since joining the Scott family and was fuming. He asked me if I had any idea who he was and how I dared to speak to a Scott that way. I told him I didn't give a damn who he was and to get out of my way. Ryan gritted his teeth and reminded me that even the Hamiltons had to show respect to the Scotts in this city. I laughed in his face. I told him the Hamiltons might respect the Scotts, but only the legitimate ones, not a bastard son like him who was just trying to play big shot. Being a bastard was the one thing Ryan was most insecure about, and I had just thrown it right in his face in the middle of a crowded store. It was a huge insult, and he was seeing red. He turned to the store manager and started screaming at him. He threatened the manager, telling him that if he ever wanted the Scott family's business again, he'd better throw me out right now. Tyler chimed in, telling the manager that I was just a nobody from the country with no real power or connections. The manager had been looking down at me since the moment I walked in, judging me by the way I was dressed. He'd been a little worried about my Hamilton connection, but once he heard Ryan's threat, he decided to side with the Scotts instead. He told me to leave the store, saying they didn't have time for customers like me. He even decided to take it a step further to impress Ryan. He demanded I hand over the shirt, telling me that even if I had the money, they wouldn't sell it to me. Ryan gave me a disgusted look and told me I was nowhere near his level. He asked me if I was insane for trying to pick a fight with a Scott. He yelled at the manager to quit standing around and get me out of there. The manager started moving toward me like he was going to lay hands on me. I just gave him a cold, hard look, and he stopped in his tracks, backing off before he could even say a word. I asked him if he was really sure he wanted to kick me out of the store. He tried to act tough, telling me that it was my own fault for crossing someone like Ryan Scott. He told me to leave before things got even worse for me. I ignored him and turned to the young sales clerk who had been helping me earlier. I asked her who she thought the shirt should be sold to. The poor girl was just a trainee and was visibly shaking with fear. She clearly felt bad for me and was disgusted by the way I was being treated. She had tried to speak up a few times, but she was too intimidated by the managers screaming to get a word in. When I asked her directly, she finally found her courage and admitted that I had been there first and had already committed to buying the shirt. She explained that I was already at the register when Ryan walked in. The manager immediately started screaming at her. He called her an idiot and asked if she was trying to get herself fired on purpose. He told her that offending someone like Ryan Scott would mean she'd never work in retail ever again. But the girl had more spine than he expected. She took off her uniform and told him she quit, saying she'd rather go back home and farm than work for him. She muttered about how the city was full of bullies and that people back home at least had a conscience. I was impressed by her guts. I picked up her jacket from the floor and handed it back to her. I told her not to worry and that I'd make sure her job was safe. Then I turned back to Ryan with a big grin. I reminded him that he'd just promised to ruin her career. I suggested we make a bet. I bet him that not only would she keep her job, but she'd be promoted to manager of the entire store by the end of the day. The manager just laughed and asked who I thought I was to be making such ridiculous claims. Ryan laughed too, telling me I had 10 minutes to see if I could actually pull it off. He thought firing a trainee was the easiest thing in the world. I just nodded and told him the bet was on. I told him we needed a prize for the winner. As I spoke, I reached up and adjusted the hidden camera on my necklace. I made sure the whole exchange was being recorded. Ryan was so confident he'd win that he was practically drooling at the thought of me failing. He suggested that the loser had to walk around the entire mall in nothing but their underwear. I frowned and told him that seemed a little extreme. Ryan immediately started taunting me, asking if I was too scared to go through with it. He suggested an alternative. The loser could crawl out of the mall on all fours like a dog instead. I gave him a dismissive smile and told him he had himself a deal. Ryan signaled the manager, who walked over to the young clerk with a smug, arrogant look on his face. He told her she was fired and that as a trainee, he didn't even need a reason to let her go. She just scoffed at him, calling him a pathetic bully who spent his whole day kissing up to rich people and picking on the staff. She said she'd rather be back home anyway. She turned to leave, but I stopped her. I told her the 10 minutes weren't up yet, and that she should stick around to see how things ended. I told her she might still get that promotion. Ryan, Tyler, and the manager all burst out laughing at the same time. I ignored them and pulled out my phone to call Sarah. I asked her if she was busy. Sarah was in the middle of a meeting, but she closed her laptop the second she saw it was me. She told me she was just taking a break. I told her that I was at the men's store in her mall, and that the manager was a total jerk. I asked her to have him fired and replaced within 5 minutes. I hung up without waiting for an answer. Ryan just laughed and said I sounded like I actually owned the place. Tyler joked that spending so much time with a crazy woman had obviously made me lose touch with reality. Ryan acted all sympathetic, saying it was a shame that my greed had led me to marry a lunatic and lose my own mind in the process. Suddenly, a man in a high-end suit came rushing into the store. The manager immediately straightened up and gave him a respectful nod. He greeted him as Manager Lee. Lee was the big boss of the entire mall, the man in charge of everything. He'd been in a meeting when Sarah called him and told him to drop everything and get to the men's store. Manager Lee looked around the room and asked which one of us was the black card holder. Tyler had no idea what he was talking about and just stood there looking confused. Ryan pulled a black card out of his wallet and gave me a smug look, thinking he was the one Lee was looking for. He asked Lee if he was there to give him some special treatment. Lee didn't even blink, telling him that his card was just a standard VIP discount card. He explained that he was looking for the exclusive gold-trimmed black card, which allowed the holder to take anything they wanted from any store in the mall. He said that with that card, a person could literally buy the entire mall. Everyone in the room looked like their hearts had stopped. They couldn't imagine anyone having that kind of power. I took my time pulling the card Sarah had given me out of my pocket. I asked him if he was looking for this card. Lee recognized it instantly and knew exactly who I was. He bowed deeply and apologized for the unpleasant experience I'd had in the store. He told me he'd take care of everything and turned to the manager, telling him he was fired and to get out of the mall right now. The manager started protesting, complaining about how hard he'd worked and how unfair it was to be fired just like that. Lee told him it was because he was stupid enough to cross the one person he should have been bowing down to. Ryan stepped forward and tried to intimidate Lee, telling him there was no way he could fire the manager on my say-so. He reminded Lee that he was a Scot and threatened to pull all of his family's business from the mall if he didn't get his way. I just raised an eyebrow and told Lee that the mall was no longer open to Mr. Scott or his family's business. Lee didn't even hesitate. He just bowed and told me it would be done. Ryan was fuming, asking Lee if he was really ready to deal with the fallout of offending the Scotts. Lee just shrugged and told him he was just an employee following his boss's orders. Tyler was still standing there like a total idiot, asking who the owner was. Lee gestured toward me and explained that I was the owner's husband. Ryan was staring at me in disbelief, asking how a hillbilly like me could possibly be married to the owner of Grandview Plaza. He asked if the owner was actually the crazy woman from the Hamilton family. Lee's gaze went icy. He told Ryan to watch his mouth and informed him that their boss had made a full recovery. Sarah had stepped out of the spotlight once the mall was a success, so very few people actually knew she was the one calling the shots. Tyler was in shock. He'd never heard of someone actually recovering from being that far gone. Lee didn't even bother talking to Tyler anymore. He just turned back to me and asked if there was anything else I needed. I pointed to the young clerk and told him I liked her attitude, so she should be the new store manager. I told him that was it. I explained that I'd only come out for a quick shopping trip and hadn't planned on getting into a bet with someone like Ryan. I knew I could handle Ryan myself, but I wanted to see if Sarah was actually willing to back me up against a family like the Scotts. She hadn't let me down. Ryan was humiliated and knew he'd lost, so he gave me one last hateful look and started to walk away. I stepped in front of him and blocked his path, asking him if he'd forgotten about our little wager. I reminded him that he was the one who insisted on the loser walking through the mall in their underwear. I told him I'd thought it was a bit much at the time, but since he'd insisted, I had no choice but to hold him to it. Ryan looked like his head was about to explode. He told me not to push my luck. I just casually looked at my fingernails and asked him what he was going to do about it. He screamed that I was dead and swung a punch at my face. I caught his fist with one hand and didn't even move. I used my other hand to slap him across the face a few more times. Tyler started yelling at me to stop. He reminded me again that Ryan was a Scott and that even the Hamiltons wouldn't be able to protect me from them. I asked Tyler if he wanted to take Ryan's place instead. I told him he should really think about whether he wanted to get involved in this. Tyler immediately shut up and backed off. I gave him a big grin and said I actually agreed that the underwear walk was a bad idea. I told Ryan he wasn't exactly in good enough shape for a public display like that anyway. I suggested he just crawl out on all fours like a dog instead, and we'd call it even. Ryan looked like he was about to cry. He admitted he couldn't beat me and begged me to let him go for the sake of his family. I asked him if he would have let me go if I'd been the one who lost. I told him we both knew the answer was no. He would have just laughed and said my crazy wife couldn't protect me. I reminded him that as a bastard son, he didn't exactly have the whole Scott family backing him up either. Ryan was a typical bully who only picked on people he thought were weaker than him. He'd finally run into someone who could actually fight back. He kept pleading, saying that making him crawl would be an insult to the entire Scott family. He actually had the nerve to turn to Tyler and ask him to crawl in his place. Tyler might have been a kiss-ass, but he wasn't about to literally act like a dog. He panicked and told Ryan that since it was his bet, he should be the one to pay the price. I gave a mockingly sad sigh and told Ryan that I couldn't let my own cousin be humiliated like that. Tyler actually looked grateful for a second until he saw the look in my eyes. He realized I was setting him up and screamed that I was deliberately trying to make Ryan Scott hate him. I ignored Tyler and forced Ryan down onto the floor. I told him my patience was gone and that it was time to start crawling. I warned him that if he didn't move, I'd make things a lot more painful for him. Ryan finally gave in, lowered his head, and started crawling across the floor. The second he was out the door and away from me, he scrambled to his feet and bolted down the mall hallway. But it was too late. Half the mall had seen him, and plenty of people had caught the whole thing on their phones. He was going to be the laughingstock of New York. Tyler gave me one last hateful look and promised that this wasn't over before he scurried away after Ryan. He knew he was in deep trouble. He'd just managed to turn one of the most powerful families in the city against him. He thought he was finally making into the big leagues, but now he'd ruined everything and probably brought a world of trouble down on his own family. I straightened my shirt and turned to the new manager, who was still standing there with her mouth open. I jokingly asked her if she was going to pack my shirt or if she didn't want the commission. She finally snapped out of it, her country accent coming out in her excitement as she told me how amazing that was. The old manager was cowering in the corner like a scared bird, waiting for me to come after him next. I didn't even give him a second glance as I walked out of the store. He was a nobody, and I wasn't about to waste any more time on him. I spent the rest of the afternoon using Sarah's card to go on a massive shopping spree. I made it back to the mansion with a carload of shopping bags. Sarah was sitting out on the terrace, watching the sunset and looking for all the world like a pampered heiress on the mend. I gave her a satisfied smile, dropped my bags on the bench, and headed straight for the shower. In reality, Sarah had spent the entire day in back-to-back meetings. She'd only put her laptop away and started relaxing when she heard I was pulling into the driveway. She had 3 years of lost time to make up for, and she was determined to get back to work as quickly as possible. Now that she was feeling better, she wanted to jump right back into the business, but I had made it very clear that she needed to stay home and focus on her recovery. Lee had already called her and given her a full report on everything that had happened at the mall. She didn't care about offending the Scotts. She was just curious about what kind of shirt could possibly be worth all that drama. Her eyes drifted over the bags I'd brought home and landed on the one from the boutique where it had all started. If it hadn't been for the phone call, she probably would have forgotten she even owned that particular store. She was bored, so she decided to see what I'd actually bought. She reached out and pulled the shirt out of the bag. I walked out of the bathroom just as she was about to open it and asked her what she thought she was doing with my bags. She jumped in surprise and dropped the bag. The expensive shirt and a pair of very brightly patterned boxers fell out, landing right on her feet. Sarah looked mortified and quickly tried to explain that she was just looking to see if I'd bought her anything. I was a little embarrassed, too. I told her she already had everything she could possibly want and that I didn't see the point in buying her a gift. I cleared my throat, trying to act like it was no big deal, and quickly stuffed the boxers into my drawer. I heard her give a soft laugh behind me. She teased me, saying that they were actually pretty nice and that she could see why I'd fought over them. Meanwhile, back at the Miller house, Tyler was falling apart. He'd been humiliated in front of everyone and had managed to make a lifelong enemy of Ryan Scott. He knew he was finished in New York, so he packed his bags and fled back to Cleveland in the middle of the night. He spent the whole night crying to his parents about what I'd done to him. His mother, Diane, was absolutely livid when she heard the story. She called me an ungrateful brat and swore she was going to the Hamilton mansion the next day to have it out with me. His father, Frank, was more interested in the news about Sarah. He asked Tyler if it was true that she was actually recovering. He said he'd never heard of anyone actually getting better after being that far gone. Tyler just shook his head, saying he didn't know either. He told them that the mall manager had confirmed she was healthy again, but nobody seemed to know how it had happened. Diane was sick with jealousy. She couldn't believe I'd lucked out like this. She'd expected me to be a widower within a week. She was convinced that Sarah's recovery was just a final rally before she inevitably died. She reasoned that if she wasn't dying, the Hamiltons never would have let me marry her in the first place. Tyler seemed to feel a bit better after hearing that. He agreed that she was probably just faking it and that the end was near. Frank sat there in silence for a few minutes, thinking. He decided they should go to the mansion and see for themselves. He reminded them that he was my uncle, which made him Sarah's uncle too. He figured that as family, they might be able to get something out of the Hamiltons if she really was healthy again. He told Tyler that he needed to swallow his pride the next day and try to get back on my good side. I kicked Sarah out of bed again the next morning. I immediately started laying into her for her behavior. I asked her why she was so obsessed with me and accused her of breaking her promise to stay on her own side of the room. I jokingly asked her if I'd been too nice to her and if she thought she could just take advantage of me whenever she felt like it. Sarah was speechless, but she'd been expecting me to react like this. She'd actually set her phone to record during the night. She showed me the video, which not only captured my nightmare, but also proved she'd stayed perfectly on her side of the bed the entire time. I watched the footage and finally calmed down. Sarah was clearly relieved that her plan had worked. But then I turned on her again, asking her who gave her permission to film me while I was sleeping and calling her a creep for doing it. She was at a total loss for words. She realized that once I made up my mind to be difficult, there was no reasoning with me. Leesery was heading out for the day when she noticed a car she didn't recognize parked at the front gate. She was told it was the Miller family, and the guards were just about to check if they were allowed in. Leesery's eyes narrowed as she realized who it was. She told the guards to skip the check and let them in immediately, calling them their dear in-laws. She knew the Millers weren't there for a friendly visit. She was sure they were either there to pick a fight with me or to beg for money. She quickly sent a text to Richard, telling him he needed to get home right away. The Millers were surprised by how friendly she was being as she personally led them into the mansion. Tyler was thinking that it was no wonder I was so arrogant if I had a mother-in-law who was this nice to me. He assumed the Hamiltons were just spoiling me. He was staring at the house, which looked more like a palace than a home. The more he saw of the luxury, the more he regretted not marrying Sarah himself. I walked into the living room just as they were getting settled. I was surprised to see them there. Frank's eyes lit up, and he even managed to squeeze out a couple of fake tears as he looked at me. He asked why I hadn't called him since the wedding and if I was enjoying my new life with the Hamiltons. I had to hand it to him. He was a great actor. I told him I hadn't realized he'd missed me that much. I teased him about the fact that I hadn't heard a word from him in weeks and thought he'd forgotten I even existed. Frank just gave a nervous laugh and told me he could never forget his only nephew. He claimed I was the person he cared about most in the world. He gave Diane a quick signal, and she immediately produced several gift boxes they'd brought with them. Frank started handing out the gifts, claiming they'd spent hours picking out the perfect things for everyone. He asked where Sarah was. I looked at the gifts and pretended to be impressed, telling them they must have spent a fortune on everything. I specifically pointed out the silk scarf for Lizuri and joked that it was probably worth more than the entire wardrobe they'd given me when I moved in. Frank could tell I was still annoyed with them and figured it was because of the drama with Tyler the day before. He pushed Tyler forward and told me that the boy had already told them everything. He asked me to be the bigger man and let it go. He told me not to be too hard on Tyler. Tyler looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, but managed to mumble out a half-hearted apology. Lizuri was suddenly very interested and asked what had happened the day before. Frank started telling his version of the story, making it sound like Tyler and Ryan were just having a friendly disagreement with me. He made it sound like I was the one who had started the fight over a shirt and had been the one being unreasonable. He accused me of offending the Scotts for absolutely no reason. Richard walked in just in time to hear the end of the story. He was livid. He yelled about how I'd spent $60,000 on a shirt and managed to piss off the Scott family at the same time. He reminded everyone that the two families had been friends for years and had dozens of business deals together. He asked me if I had any idea how much trouble I'd caused and if Sarah was aware of how reckless I was being. Richard was screaming at me, and Frank realized he might have made things a bit too difficult for me. He tried to calm Richard down. He told Richard not to be too hard on me, saying I was just a country boy who had gotten a little too excited by all the luxury. He asked Richard to forgive my mistakes and offered to apologize on my behalf. I was bored by the entire performance and started heading back upstairs. Tyler, being as oblivious as ever, asked if I could give him a tour of the mansion. I gave him a look that told him exactly where he could go, and he immediately shut his mouth. Frank, who still didn't realize who he was dealing with, followed me up the stairs and asked why I was walking away. He asked about Sarah's health and told me I should take them upstairs to see her. I told him no, explaining that my wife was resting and didn't want to be bothered by people she didn't know. Frank was offended and asked how I could call them outsiders when they were my family. Lizuri, who never missed a chance to stir the pot, said that Sarah seemed to be doing just fine when she'd seen her earlier that morning. She suggested there was no reason Sarah couldn't say hello to her husband's family. She said it was part of being a good wife. Sarah's cold voice echoed through the hallway, asking who said she was hiding from anyone. Everyone turned to see Sarah walking down the stairs, looking every bit the elegant heiress she was. She didn't even need her wheelchair anymore, and she looked like she had never been sick a day in her life. Tyler was staring at her with his mouth open. Nobody had ever told him just how beautiful Sarah Hamilton actually was. She looked healthy and vibrant. It killed him to think that she was supposed to have been his wife. He was furious that a guy like me had ended up with her. Sarah didn't even look in his direction. The coldness in her eyes only softened when her gaze landed on me. She asked why I hadn't told her my family was visiting. I told her I hadn't even known they were there until I'd walked into the room. Sarah got the message loud and clear. The Millers had just barged into the house without an invitation. Richard walked over and started complaining to Sarah about me again. He told her all about my fight with Ryan Scott and how I'd supposedly embarrassed the family. He warned her that the Scotts were definitely going to come after me. Sarah cut him off mid-sentence. She told him that anyone who tried to take something from her husband was lucky she hadn't already gone after them herself. Richard was screaming now, calling her disrespectful and asking where her manners were. He reminded her that the Hamilton Group had a massive partnership with the Scotts that was now at risk. He asked if she had any idea how much money the family stood to lose if the Scotts pulled out. Sarah just laughed and told him that Caleb was the one who had been handling the Scotts for the last few years, not her. She reminded him that since he'd walked away from the company years ago, he should probably stop trying to tell her how to run it. He called her an ungrateful daughter, shaking with rage as he spoke. But he knew he couldn't win an argument with her. He just turned and walked out of the room in defeat. I didn't want Sarah getting involved in my family's mess. I turned back to Frank and asked him what he was really after. I told him to just get to the point. He asked if we could talk in private, and I was curious enough to agree. I told Sarah to go back to her room and that I'd handle everything with the Millers. I led Frank to one of the sitting rooms upstairs. As Sarah turned to leave, Diane called out to her with a sugary sweet smile. She called Sarah her favorite new niece and told her how incredibly beautiful she was. She said I was the luckiest guy in the world and invited Sarah to sit down and have a chat. She mentioned that I used to tell her everything when I was a kid. That got Sarah's attention immediately. Diane started telling her all sorts of funny stories about my childhood before steering the conversation where she wanted it to go. She told Sarah that Tyler and I had been best friends since we were kids and were practically inseparable. She suggested that Tyler should tell Sarah some more stories about her past. Then she turned to Leezery. She asked if Leezery would mind giving her a tour of the garden. Diane had seen the way Tyler was looking at Sarah and decided to help her son out by getting everyone else out of the room. She was trying to give them some alone time. Leezery saw exactly what she was doing and was happy to play along. She figured the Millers were a great way to make my life miserable. She gave Diane a polite smile and led her out to the garden. Once they were alone, Tyler asked Sarah if I was being good to her. He told her not to mind my temper, calling me an uneducated country boy who didn't know how to treat a lady. He told her he hoped she wasn't too disappointed with me. Sarah just gave him a cold, neutral response. Tyler noticed her surprised expression and assumed I had done a great job of fooling her with my act. He was determined to blow my cover and show her the truth. He leaned in closer, rambling on until he finally circled back to the point he actually wanted to make. He reminded her that he was originally the one supposed to be her husband. Sarah's eyes narrowed, a dangerous flicker appearing in the cold depths of her gaze. She simply replied that she understood exactly what he was trying to say. Tyler was completely oblivious to the shift in the room's atmosphere as he tried to get even closer to her. He asked if he could call her Sarah and suggested that life with a man like me must be incredibly difficult. He claimed I was a crude, uneducated man, unlike him. He insisted he was far more considerate and knew how to treat a woman. Meanwhile, upstairs in the study, I sat with my arms crossed and told Frank to quit the games. I demanded to know exactly why he had come here today. I asked him what he wanted from me. Frank just sat there with a greasy, self-satisfied smile on his face. He told me that since we were family, he'd get straight to the point. He explained that his company was in debt to the bank and that some operational issues had made it impossible for him to pay them back. He noted that the Hamiltons were swimming in cash and suggested that I borrow $10 million to help him bridge the gap. A $10 million check was pocket change for a family like this. I laughed and asked him why on earth I would ever give him that kind of money. Frank didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. He reminded me that we were family and told me not to forget my roots. He claimed that without the Miller family's connections, I never would have landed a prize like the Hamilton inheritance. I just scoffed at his operational issues, knowing full well he'd gambled everything away. I called him out for losing his shirt and then tried to embezzle company funds to cover his tracks, which was why he was now in hot water with the bank. The Hamiltons had already paid him a fortune when the marriage contract was signed. But the second he heard Sarah was crazy, he shoved me into the spotlight to take his son's place. I asked him if he had anything to say in his defense. Frank looked like I just slapped him. He was shocked that I knew about his gambling, something he'd even managed to keep hidden from his own wife. I told him I hadn't originally planned on making him pay back the wedding dowry he'd stolen. But now he had the nerve to show up at my door and ask for another $10 million. I asked him where he found the audacity to even speak to me. Frank's face turned red with anger. He called me a blind fool and reminded me that he was my uncle and my only living relative. He demanded to know how I could be so disrespectful to him. He argued that even if he had been a little manipulative, I was the one who ended up living in a mansion with a billionaire's bank account. I just gave him a disgusted look and laughed. I told him the only reason I hadn't thrown him out already was out of respect for my father's memory. I was only listening to his garbage because he shared my dad's blood. I warned him that if he ever came back to harass me again, I wouldn't be so patient. Frank was stunned. He couldn't believe this was the same man who had been so easy to push around just a week ago. He was desperate for the money, so he decided to switch tactics. He mocked me for thinking I was a big shot now and asked if I even remember my father at all. My mood darkened instantly. I demanded to know exactly what he was implying with that comment. He brought up the car accident that killed my parents and asked if I was really satisfied with the official story of how they died. I told him I remembered that night perfectly. It was the eve of my 10th birthday, and they were racing home to celebrate with me when the crash happened. They were both gone in an instant. I had been just a kid back then, so it never occurred to me that it might have been anything other than an accident. But hearing Frank bring it up now made a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. I began to realize that the accident might have been something much more sinister. Frank gave a fake sigh and talked about how he was the only one left to handle the funeral arrangements. He claimed he'd suspected something from the beginning and that his own private investigation had turned up some interesting leads. I grabbed him and demanded to know what he had found. A greasy, cunning smile spread across his face. He told me that this was why family was so important and that only relatives could truly be trusted in a crisis. He admitted he hadn't been the best uncle, but he reminded me that he was my father's only brother. He had the nerve to say that if my father were still alive, he would have done anything to help his brother out of jam. I asked him flat out if he was trying to blackmail me. Frank just laughed as if I told a joke. He called it family helping family. He suggested that if I gave him the money he needed, he would tell me everything he knew about my father's death, calling it a fair trade. I told him that threats were the one thing I couldn't stand. I closed my eyes and warned him to leave before I lost my temper and did something he'd regret. Frank was confused, asking if I really didn't want to know the truth about what had happened to my mother and father. He called me ungrateful and accused me of not caring about getting justice for my own parents. He mockingly suggested my father would be proud of the man I'd become. I snapped my eyes open, the rage boiling over. I told him through gritted teeth that he wasn't even worthy of speaking their names. He was clearly terrified by the look in my eyes, but his greed was stronger than his fear. He sneered and asked if I thought I was any better than him. He called me the ultimate ungrateful son for refusing to investigate my parents' deaths, even when I knew something was wrong. He claimed they were rolling in their graves and demanded the $10 million right then and there. He threatened to use his authority as head of the Miller family to dig up my parents' graves if I didn't pay up. He warned me that I'd never have a place to visit them again. I slammed my fist onto the coffee table with a deafening bang. The heavy marble top shattered into a million pieces. I calmly flexed my hand and looked at him. I told him that I'd intended for that punch to land on his face, but I didn't want to get his blood on my hands. I told him I'd been willing to let the past go, but he just kept pushing and pushing until I had no choice but to react. I reminded him that if he'd just been honest about my parents from the start, I might have actually helped him out of respect for a family bond. I told him that $10 million was nothing to me, but I couldn't forgive him for trying to use my parents' deaths as a way to extort me. I made it clear that I, Morrison, had no interest in a family that was built on lies and manipulation. The sheer intensity of my rage sent Frank stumbling back until he collapsed onto the floor. He stammered, asking what I was going to do to him. I told him not to worry. Now that I knew there was more to my parents' deaths, I was going to find the truth on my own. I brought up his embezzlement and told him I was looking forward to seeing how many years he'd get in prison for it. Frank turned as pale as a sheet. He knew embezzlement was a serious felony and had been desperate to pay the money back before anyone found out. He started begging for forgiveness, claiming he'd only threatened me because he was desperate and didn't know what else to do. He called me his dear nephew and literally got on his knees, begging for help as he started banging his head against the floor. He swore he'd never actually touch my parents' graves and promised to tell me everything he knew if I'd just help him. I told him to save it and ordered him to get out and never show his face to me again. Frank scrambled out of the room, completely defeated. He looked a lot different than he had when he'd first arrived, acting like he owned the place. But his wife and son were having an even worse time than he was. Tyler had managed to piss off Sarah so much that the security team was currently tossing him out on the street. Diane and Leesery came running when they heard the commotion. Diane immediately assumed it was my fault and started screaming at me without even knowing what had happened. She didn't even wait for me to get downstairs before she started her tirade, which only made Sarah even more furious. Sarah didn't hesitate. She ordered her security team to literally pick them up and throw them out of the house. She made it clear that they were banned from the Hamilton property for life. Once the Miller family was finally gone, the mansion felt peaceful again. A sense of calm finally returned to the house. Sarah looked up as she saw me coming down the stairs. She told me I should probably stay away from my cousin, noting that he seemed to spend his whole life making up lies about me. She said I was better off without relatives like that and asked if I was okay with her tossing them out. I gave her a serious look and told her I actually did mind, but only because throwing them out was far too kind. I told her if it were up to me, I would have locked the gates and let the dogs loose on them for a bit. I joked about giving them a real scare before kicking them out. Sarah couldn't help but give a little smile. She agreed that having a few guard dogs around might not be a bad idea for dealing with unwanted guests. Her joke actually made me laugh, and it helped clear away some of the rage I was still feeling toward Frank. Once I calmed down, I asked her what else my cousin had said about me. I asked if he'd mentioned that he was supposed to be the one marrying her, and that I was just a last-minute replacement. Just thinking about sitting on the same sofa as Tyler made Sarah's skin crawl. She looked genuinely revolted by the idea. She actually called the staff over and ordered them to throw the entire sofa in the trash immediately. She looked me in the eye and told me she was glad things had turned out the way they did. She thanked me for sticking by her when everyone else thought she was a lunatic. I joked that I'd only stayed because I was actually crazier than she was. Then I started grabbing my keys to head out. Sarah looked confused, reminding me that I'd said I was staying home for the day. She asked where I was going. I told her I had some business to take care of and gave her a quick wink. I teased her about needing me out of the house so she could finally get some work done in peace. She was shocked, asking how I knew she'd been working. She swore she'd hidden her laptop before I'd even walked through the door the night before. I told her it was simple. I noticed the battery life on her laptop was higher when I came home than when I left. I knew that meant she'd been using it and had kept it plugged in the entire time, so she wouldn't lose any of her work. I told her my line of work made me notice small details like that. But I also mentioned that her pulse told me she was exhausted. I could feel the fatigue in her body, and she looked a little guilty for getting caught. She apologized for not listening to my advice, admitting that she was being a terrible patient by hiding things from me. I told her that since she was feeling better, I'd let her work for 2 hours, but not a single minute more. She laughed at how serious I was being and jokingly gave me a salute, calling me honey. Hearing her call me honey actually threw me for a second, but also made me feel a lot better about where we stood. I was her husband on paper, after all. The second I left the mansion, she was back to business. Sarah immediately called her assistant, Axel, and ordered him to run a full background check on me. She wanted to know every single thing he could find. She hadn't originally planned on digging into my past, but things had changed. Tyler's comment about me being missing for 10 years had sparked her curiosity. She needed to know where I'd been and what I'd been doing all that time. She wanted to understand the source of my nightmares. It wasn't just curiosity. She actually cared about me. She had an almost desperate need to understand who I really was. Axel was known for being fast, and he didn't disappoint. It took him less than 10 minutes to call her back with everything he'd found on me. I was just pulling out of the driveway when I felt my necklace vibrate. It was a silent signal that my listening device had been activated. Seconds later, I could hear Axel's voice speaking through the tiny earpiece I was wearing. The device was standard issue for my agency. Usually, it was just used for tracking and video feeds, but it could also intercept nearby calls. I knew exactly why I was able to hear Sarah's conversation. It was clear that my handler, Jackson, was messing with the settings again. Jackson never could resist eavesdropping. Sure enough, his lazy voice came through the comms, joking about how my wife was digging into my past. He told me he'd set up a live feed of her call so I could hear everything Axel was telling her. He told me not to worry about thanking him. I just gave a frustrated sigh and asked him if he didn't have anything better to do with his time. He joked that at least he was busier than a guy who was living off his billionaire wife's money. Jackson laughed and switched the audio over so I could hear Axel's report. Axel told her my real name was Morrison Miller and that my parents had died in a crash when I was 10. I had completely disappeared from the grid after that. He said I had been spotted near the border in Southeast Asia about 3 months after the accident. He believed I'd been a victim of human trafficking before being rescued by a specialized U.S. Border Task Force. I had been placed in a witness protection program and given years of specialized combat and intelligence training. He told her that my current files were classified, but that I was officially listed as an external consultant for a high-level government agency. He also brought up a kidnapping that had happened at a gala 5 years ago. He told her about the young man who had saved her that night. Every detail of the rescue, from the timing to the combat style, matched my profile perfectly. The line went dead silent for a few seconds as Sarah processed what she was hearing. I could hear Sarah's breath hitch as she asked Axel for one more piece of information. Axel told her that my parents, David and Sarah, had both been employees at one of the Hamilton Group subsidiaries. My father had worked in logistics, while my mother was an inspector for their pharmaceutical division. It looked like they had uncovered a connection between Hamilton Logistics and the smuggling of miasma vine. He concluded that the accident that killed them was almost certainly a professional hit. There was total silence on the other end of the line. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, my eyes turning cold and hard. It had taken 12 years, but I finally had the definitive proof I'd been looking for. Jackson's voice cut back in, telling me the show was over and that he had all the evidence waiting for me at a warehouse on the south side of the city. He confirmed that Caleb was the real mastermind, not Lee Zuri. Caleb ran the operation while Olivia handled the money and the Scotts took care of distribution. I realized Lee Zuri was just a tool they were using, and a pretty incompetent one at that. I asked about Dr. Evans's role in all of this. Jackson called him a hired lackey. He'd found everything. Where the silver needles came from, the exact chemical makeup of the miasma vine, and every single change they'd made to Sarah's prescriptions. He'd even recovered some footage from my parents' dash cam. The last thing on the audio was someone calling out Caleb's name. I took a long, slow breath as the reality of it all sank in. Jackson's voice was unusually serious as he spoke to me. He warned me that this was a lot deeper and dirtier than we had initially thought. He said he wouldn't stop me from getting revenge, but he wanted me to keep a cool head. I told him not to worry and that I had no intention of getting my hands dirty. An hour later, I was pulling up to the warehouse. I met one of Jackson's men at an old warehouse and took delivery of 2 heavy files. The first was my parents' final records from the night they died. The second was a detailed log of the Hamilton Group's illegal smuggling and money laundering over the last 3 years. I sat in my car and listened to the audio from that night over and over again. I could hear my mother's voice, sounding frantic as she talked about a shipment of herbs that needed to be reported immediately. Then I heard my father yelling at Caleb to stay out of things he didn't understand. Then came the sound of tires screeching and a violent crash, followed by absolute silence. I sat there staring out the windshield, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. It all made sense now. My parents had been killed to keep them quiet, and I'd been kidnapped in the aftermath to make sure there were no witnesses left. It was no wonder every lead I'd ever followed had eventually led me back to the Hamiltons. Caleb had been the Scotts' personal cleaner for 12 years. 3 years ago, Sarah had stumbled onto the same secret, and they'd made her go crazy to stop her from talking. They'd systematically destroyed her mind to protect their business. It was late at night by the time I finally pulled back into the Hamilton driveway. I walked into our room and found Sarah sitting by the window in the dark. The only light came from a small lamp on the wall, casting a soft glow around her. She slowly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were different tonight. She looked calmer and more focused than I'd ever seen her. She was holding a small, crescent-shaped jade pendant in her hand. I froze the moment I saw it. She spoke in a low voice, telling me she'd been waiting for me. She said she'd found the pendant 5 years ago, on the night I'd saved her. She told me she'd kept it with her ever since, using it as a sort of lucky charm to keep her grounded when the nightmares became too much to handle. She said she'd finally realized I was the boy who had saved her all those years ago. I felt a lump form in my throat, and I couldn't even find the words to speak. She clutched the pendant tightly and looked up at me. She told me she'd never forgotten the boy who saved her and then vanished without a trace. She said she was finally sure it was me. She thanked me for everything I'd done and apologized for not being there to help me carry the burden of the past. I walked over and sat down on the edge of the bed next to her. The curtains fluttered in the light breeze, and the room was silent except for the sound of our breathing. We sat there in silence for a long time. She tried to give the pendant back to me, but I just closed her hand around it and pressed it back in her palm. I told her to keep it. I promised her that once we had settled all our scores, we would start a new life together. She asked me if I was the one who had saved her from those kidnappers 5 years ago. I didn't answer right away. I just walked over, closed the door, and sat down in the chair across from her. She placed the jade pendant on the table, her hand shaking slightly. She remembered the rain and how I'd carried her out of that warehouse as if it were yesterday. She remembered me giving her my coat, even though I'd been stabbed in the shoulder. She'd realized later that I'd lied about it being just a scratch. She said I'd left in such a rush that I'd dropped the pendant in the back of the car. She told me she'd spent the last 5 years trying to find me. I looked at the pendant and couldn't help but give a small smile. I couldn't believe she still remembered all those details after all this time. I reached up and unclasped my own necklace. I pulled off the matching half of the jade pendant and set on the table next to hers. The two pieces fit together perfectly, forming a complete moon. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she realized I was telling the truth. I tried to act like it was no big deal, joking that if I'd known she was going to obsess over me for 5 years, I would have at least given her my name. I joked about us already being married with kids by now, if I had. But she wasn't laughing. She just sat there staring at me with a look of pure intensity. She asked me why I hadn't told her sooner. I took the pendant and gently placed it back in her hand. I told her that she'd been too sick for it to matter and admitted that my reasons for being in the house went beyond just her. She asked if I was there for my parents, and I nodded. I told her I was there for them, but I was also there for her. She clutched the jade tightly, her knuckles turning white. She told me she'd already heard everything Axel had found out about me. She looked up at me with eyes as cold as ice. She told me she'd discovered the truth about the miasma vine 3 years ago. She had found the illegal shipments in one of the family's warehouses. The very next day, they had started drugging her with the toxin. After that, Evans had started using the needle to treat her, and she had slowly lost all control over her own mind. That was how she'd become the crazy woman everyone talked about. I told her in a low voice that we both knew Caleb was the one behind the whole thing. I explained how Caleb ran the show, while Olivia handled the money and the Scotts took care of the dirty work. I noted that Leesery might not have known everything, but she was definitely involved. She might have been a puppet, but she was still the one who had kept Sarah locked in that room and helped poison her. Sarah slowly closed her eyes, taking it all in. When she opened them again, her gaze was filled with a cold, hard determination. She told me it was time to end this once and for all. The next day, Sarah called an emergency board meeting for the Hamilton Group. She personally sent out the notice. She put out a statement saying her condition had worsened and that she was stepping down as CEO. She said she was handing over control of logistics and the mall to Caleb. As we'd expected, Caleb was at the meeting before anyone else. I pushed Sarah into the conference room in her wheelchair. She put on some makeup to make herself look even paler and more fragile than she actually was. She looked like she was on the verge of death, making everyone in the room think they were about to witness her final act. Richard looked devastated when he saw her, while Leesery had the nerve to pretend to be crying as she watched her stepdaughter fail. Caleb was saying all the right things about how much he cared, but he couldn't hide the look of pure greed in his eyes. Dr. Evans was there too, still playing the part of the dedicated physician with an oily, fake smile on his face. He addressed the board, claiming that Sarah was in no condition to work and needed to be placed under permanent care. He suggested that the board grant Caleb full power of attorney over her affairs to ensure the company continued to run smoothly. I stood behind Sarah and let out a loud, mocking laugh at the mention of guardianship. I called Evans a hack who specialized in making his patients worse and asked him how he had the nerve to even speak to the board. Caleb's face went dark as he reminded me that this was a professional meeting and that I should watch my mouth. I looked at his perfect, polished exterior and couldn't help but find the whole situation fascinating. I noted that some people were far more dangerous when they hid their true nature. Sarah sat there silently, looking down at her hands. She reached up to rub her temples and whispered in a weak voice that Caleb should take over the meeting. Caleb looked like he was about to burst with joy. He immediately signaled his secretary to bring out the papers for him to sign. He promised Sarah that he was only stepping in temporarily and that he'd give the company back the second she was feeling better. I just smiled and pressed a button on a remote I'd been holding. The massive screen at the front of the room flickered to life. The first video showed the hidden warehouse from 3 years ago. It caught the exact moment Caleb and his men cornered Sarah after she'd found the miasma vine. The board watched as Sarah confronted him, and Caleb just gave her a cold, empty smile. The next clip showed Dr. Evans deliberately altering her prescriptions to include the toxin. The third video was of Wallace taking a briefcase full of cash to lock Sarah away and keep her isolated from the rest of the family. The final screen showed a detailed log of every illegal transaction between Hamilton Logistics and their partners in the drug trade. It even included invoices from the Scott family's own warehouses. The board members erupted in shock and anger. Caleb turned as white as a sheet, and Dr. Evans literally collapsed into his chair, unable to even stand. Olivia jumped up and started screaming that it was all a lie and that the evidence had been faked. I asked her if she really thought it was faked, and then hit play on the final audio file. My mother's terrified voice filled the room, followed by my father yelling at Caleb to get out of their way. Caleb's cool exterior finally shattered. I started walking toward him, my voice like ice as I spoke. I told him he had killed my parents 12 years ago and then tried to destroy my wife's mind 3 years ago. I asked him how he thought he should pay for all of it. He backed away, stammering that a single recording didn't prove anything and that I had no real evidence of murder. Sarah suddenly stood up from her wheelchair and told him she had all the proof he'd ever need. She walked straight up to Caleb, her eyes burning with a cold, hard rage. She reminded him of the words he'd said to her in the warehouse 3 years ago about how the Hamilton Empire was too big for a woman to handle. She accused him of ordering his men to hold her down while Dr. Evans gave her the first dose of the poison. Caleb looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He couldn't believe she was fully recovered and remembered every single detail of what they'd done to her. Leasery's voice broke as she realized Sarah had been faking her illness and had been planning this the whole time. I told them they were right and that faking it was the only way to make sure every single one of them got exactly what they deserved. Right on cue, the doors to the conference room burst open and a dozen police officers came rushing in. The lead officer pulled out his badge and called out the names of Caleb, Olivia, Dr. Evans, and Wallace. He told them they were under arrest for everything from assault and kidnapping to poisoning and money laundering. He ordered them to come with him quietly. Caleb finally snapped. He grabbed a pen from the table and lunged towards Sarah, screaming at her as he went. He yelled that he'd destroy her just like he had before. But before he could get close, I stepped in and kicked him hard in the back of the leg. He collapsed onto the floor with a thud. I grabbed him by the shoulder and held him down. I hit a pressure point on his shoulder that sent a wave of agonizing pain through his body, causing his face to twist in agony. I leaned in close and whispered to him that I hoped he lived a long, long time. I told him I wanted him to spend every single day in prison remembering exactly how he'd lost everything. The rest of the investigation went even better than we'd hoped. The police used the evidence against Caleb to build an airtight case. They quickly dismantled the entire criminal network that had been running between Hamilton Logistics and the Scotts for years. The Scott family moved fast to protect themselves, tossing Ryan and several other lower-level relatives under the bus to save the main branch of the family. But the scandal was so massive that even the Scotts' main family suffered a huge blow to their reputation and finances. Olivia was arrested as an accomplice, and Dr. Evans lost his license and his reputation overnight. Wallace, who had spent years bullying the staff, finally ended up behind bars. As for Big Mike, he was arrested again and immediately deported back to his own country. With a permanent ban on ever returning to the U.S., Leasery was hit with a mountain of charges, including kidnapping, abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. She tried to play the victim at first, but with the amount of evidence we had against her, she didn't have a leg to stand on. Richard finally seemed to realize what kind of woman he'd married and filed for divorce immediately. He stepped down from all his positions in the company, finally admitting that he was partly to blame for letting things get so bad. I heard later that he spent most of his days sitting by his late wife's grave, seemingly full of regret for the life he'd led. Henry was terrified at first, but he eventually did the right thing and testified against his mother and Caleb. Sarah decided to be merciful and sent him away to school in Europe instead of making him face charges. But she gave him a very clear warning that if he ever came back to cause trouble, she wouldn't hesitate to end him. Faye had never been involved in the family's illegal dealings, so she took over the Hamilton Foundation and turned it into a real force for good. I didn't even have to lift a finger to deal with my Uncle Frank. Jackson's team took care of him for me. They handed over all the proof of his gambling and embezzlement to the police, and he was arrested that same day. Diane tried to save him by selling their house and cars, but it wasn't even close to enough to cover what he'd stolen. Tyler's life was a complete disaster. He made an enemy of the Scott family and was completely cut off from the Hamiltons. He slunk back to Cleveland in disgrace and was never heard from again. Manager Lee is still running things over at Grandview Plaza. The young clerk I'd helped out has done incredibly well for herself. She turned out to be a natural at management. She worked her way up to regional director and still calls me boss every time she sees me. It's a bit embarrassing, but I'm happy for her. Once the dust had finally settled on the whole scandal, Jackson asked me when I was coming back to work. I told him I was taking a long leave of absence instead. I'd spent my entire adult life chasing criminals and solving cases. Now that I'd finally settled my own score, I just wanted to relax for a while. Besides, I had a beautiful wife at home who seemed to have a habit of wandering into my bed in the middle of the night. One evening, Sarah asked me to meet her in the private glass greenhouse on top of the mall. The sun was setting, and the whole city was bathed in a beautiful golden light. She was standing in the middle of the flowers, looking healthy and beautiful in a simple white dress. She turned to look at me when she heard me coming. I had to admit, she was even more breathtaking when she was herself than she ever was before. I asked her what she wanted, trying to play it cool with my hands in my pockets. I joked that since she was healthy now, she was probably planning on kicking me to the curb. I told her I was a very valuable asset to have around. But she didn't laugh. She just looked at me with a serious expression. She opened her hand, and I saw she was holding the crescent jade pendant. I reached up and felt my own half of the pendant through my shirt. She spoke my name softly. She told me she'd been looking for me for 5 years and that she'd almost lost herself along the way. But she said that in the end, it was me who had finally found her and brought her back. I felt a sudden surge of emotion, but I tried to keep my voice steady. I joked that she was starting to sound like she was confessing her feelings for me and told her she should be careful or I might get the wrong idea. She took a step toward me until she was standing just inches away. She told me it wasn't a misunderstanding at all. She looked me in the eye and told me she was confessing. I actually found myself at a loss for words for once. She looked up at me, the golden light of the sunset reflecting in her eyes along with my own image. She reminded me of when I'd asked her why she only promised to honor and respect me, but never said she loved me. She said she was finally ready to give me an answer. My throat felt tight as I told her I was listening. She looked me in the eye and told me she loved me, saying each word with total conviction. She said it wasn't because of the rescue or because I was her husband on paper. She said she loved me for the man I was today, just because I was Morrison. I swallowed hard, trying to process what she was saying. Before I could speak, she reached out for me. She grabbed me by the collar and pulled my face down to hers. She whispered that there was one more thing I needed to know, her warm breath against my lips. She told me she was never letting me go and that the position of husband was permanently taken. Then she stood on her tiptoes and kissed me. I was frozen for a second, but then I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her close, deepening the kiss. Outside, the sky was a beautiful blaze of orange and gold. Our shadows were reflected in the glass of the greenhouse as we stood there together. In that moment, it felt like the entire city had stopped just for us. I knew we had a long life ahead of us. But for the first time in my life, I knew I would never have to face the world alone again.